Okay. I believe you have to authorize that. No. Okay.
No, we already started. Okay.
Okay. All right then. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the sixth of the series entitled Latest Research on the Philosophy of Law, organized by the Philosophical Association of Turkey. Please allow me to present our guest speaker, Helga Varden, and extend our gratitude for accepting the invitation and joining us this evening. Helga Varden is professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She specializes on Kant's practical philosophy, the history of legal political philosophy, especially Hobbes, Rousseau, Locke, Kant, Rawls, Arendt, and Nozick, the history of feminist philosophy, especially Beauvoir, the history of social philosophy, especially race, sex, and gender. Her first monograph, Sex, Love, and Gender, a Kantian Theory, was published by Oxford University Press in 2022. And her forthcoming book, Transforming Our Social Contracts, a Kantian Contribution, will also be published by the same Oxford University Press. Professor Varden also has numerous articles, papers, book reviews on her research areas. Now, please allow me to also introduce the discussant, Özlem Duva. Özlem Duva is professor of philosophy at 9 Eylül University. Her areas of specialization extend from Kant to philosophical anthropology, gender studies, and feminism, on which she published extensively. We also thank her for joining us today and looking forward to the comments on the talk. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Varden to give her talk titled Kantian for Political Conditions, Barbarism, Anarchy, Despotism, and Republic. Professor Varden, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much for being here on a Saturday evening. And of course, thank you especially to Özlem, who has spent a lot of this week thinking about how to comment on a presentation she has not really seen yet. So she knows what I'm going to say. We have met, so she roughly knows what I'm going to say, but she did not have the written word to orient her comments. So that, in other words, takes true excellence. So thank you, Özlem, for being such a flexible person.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So I wonder if it's okay if I share the screen. So then then you have something to look at other than me, which I think will be lovely. I think I can do it. Yeah. And so let me know if, is it okay? Yeah. So thank you so much for being here. So as you know, and as was just said, not so long ago, I wrote a book on Kant, Sex, Love, and Gender. And I'm currently working towards my next book. That is, I am working on it, but I'm also working towards it. There's a sense in which I think until it's done, I'm not also working towards it. And as was also mentioned, I work in Kant's practical philosophy. And if I were to describe my particular favorite way of doing it for me, which is not to say that it's favorite for everyone, but for me, I love systematic philosophy, as you could also see. Like, I love these sort of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, you know, and part of why I love them a lot is they're very systematic. And so part of what draws me to Kant in particular, I'm not entirely sure, to be quite honest. Why do I like, say, Kant rather than Locke in the heart of hearts? So why don't I go with Aristotle or Hegel or Spinoza? There are many options. My current hypothesis, which I don't know if it's true, is that where we start, both what questions we start with and the particular philosopher we kind of, whose philosophy we trust, has something to do with where we start in life. So I currently believe that, perhaps strange as it may sound, why we choose the philosopher we choose to start with is somewhat contingent. It depends on who we are and what kinds of questions feel very important to us. And my favorite story around this at the moment of this choice, which I've thought a lot about lately, after all, many of my favorite people in the world are not Kantians. They choose a different starting point and they do not work on the issues I work on. And my favorite story about it was, which seems significant to me, was that I was walking with a very good friend in the fall, and my friend was battling cancer at the time, a fight he lost. But these conversations we had as we were walking were they were always wonderful. He was one of those amazing philosophical souls. And we did end up talking about exactly why is it the case that I prefer to work with Kant or Kant's philosophy, and he's a Hegelian at heart. He likes Kant, but there's a deep sense in which he is a Hegelian at heart. And our hypothesis in our last walk was that, well, his life is deeply informed by the fact that he's Jewish. And so there's a way in which community is profoundly important, the Jewish community, including the way in which, of course, having a Jewish identity means that you have a long, complicated history of oppression and violence. But there's a sense, too, in which that is shared among Jewish peoples. It's a sort of a communal starting point, both on who you are in that regard, and also the burden of it has also to do with, knowing the oppression coming at you, you also know that of previous generations. So a little bit similar to, say, being a woman. You share what you know of oppression or life's difficulties just because you're a woman is something you share with your mother, your grandmother, and that's part of the heaviness of it, what makes it hard to handle it well. I am, of course, a woman, but I'm also married to a woman. And so in my view, perhaps one reason why I have Kant as sort of the philosophical system I trust with, so to say, my life. So it's how I am as a scholar, probably has something to do, or so I think, with the fact that Kant puts dignity with each individual, and he puts the inner right to freedom with each individual. And so a significant aspect, I think, or existential experience of being LGBTQIA+ is that you are fully aware that the people that you are considered in certain sense, both you experience yourself as being a problem, but also that everybody else, including those who love you, consider you a problem. And you also know most places on the planet, being you is not just to be a problem, but being you is something that can get you killed. And so I think that is why ultimately Kant was the one I trusted, because I don't trust Kant the man. Kant the man had lots of prejudices, maybe he was even a bit self-hating when it comes to LGBTQIA. A lot of scholars, not just me, think that. But, he was sexist, racist, heterosexist, all of that. But I somehow trust his system. And I suspect it's because exactly the dignity lies with the individual and the inner right to freedom lies with the individual. And that's something that I can trust, or I do trust. Another reason probably is, and he'll show you this part, Kant is very, very much a systematic thinker, as you said. I'm very, very nerdy. I've been, as I am LGBTQIA, I've been, as probably all of you who are here on a Saturday evening at 8 o'clock, very nerdy. And my particular kind of nerdiness is very systematic, and Kant is very satisfying when it comes to systems. And so I work in this scheme for now of Kant's practical philosophy. And before going into the 4 political conditions, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about that, a tiny bit about then how the first book is, the second book, and then these 4 political conditions and how that fits into what I'm thinking a lot about at the moment. So as maybe many of you, can you see my arrow when I move it here? Yeah. So as probably many of you know, for the longest time in Kant studies, everybody was reading the groundwork, or maybe the critique of practical reason. If you look in this big old scheme of very many important bits of Kant, if you look here, then in a certain sense, this is where they were reading, right? They were thinking about virtue in Kant, reading the groundwork or the critique of practical reason, thinking an enormous amount about the categorical imperative, the fact that it is exactly an imperative. So we experience the moral law as something that is obliging us or issuing an obligation on us. And then we had lots and lots and lots and lots of articles and books on perfect, imperfect duties to self and others. So it's not much of an exaggeration to say that for 200 years, that's what everybody was doing in Kant's practical philosophy, exaggerating a little bit, but really not super unfairly. You might also know, especially since you all are interested in law, that in the last maybe 20 years or so, late 90s into 2000s, 25 maybe at this point, the doctrine of right has received a tremendous amount of attention. And so the doctrine of right here is, if you read the Metaphysics of Morals, not the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, but the Metaphysics of Morals, the Metaphysics of Morals has 2 parts, virtue and right. And this book, the doctrine, so the second part is the doctrine of virtue. Again, a lot of the discussions you find in the groundwork of critique of practical reason. The other part, the first part, is called the doctrine of right, which is Kant's sort of most systematic presentation of his legal philosophy. In the last 20, 25 years, maybe, that has received a lot of attention in Kant studies. And that's where I was trained. So I was trained, it's also not a super exaggeration to say in the English-speaking world, Ernest Weinrib and Arthur Ripstein was very, very influenced for making the doctrine of right a player in legal and political philosophy in the English-speaking world. And Arthur Ripstein was the one who trained me, and I wrote exactly my dissertation at the time he was writing Force and Freedom. And so my dissertation was, non-surprisingly, on Kant and Locke on political obligations, which is basically a lot of training in understanding what Kant means by the universal principle of right, the inner right to freedom, and the corresponding duty of rightful honor, and private right and public right. So what becomes private law and public law. And over here you see PPR, this is his account of private property right, CR is contract right, and SR is status right. So for a long time too, that this is really what I worked a lot on. And a nice thing about the doctrine of right having become a real player in legal and political philosophy, was that Kantians no longer were trying to solve every single problem in practical philosophy just with the tools available if you do the categorical imperative and perfect and imperfect duties, right? And that didn't go so well. If you try and solve every issue, right, in practical philosophy just with the tools you're going to find in the groundworks discussion of the ought, that I ought to do something with a categorical imperative and perfect and imperfect duties, you end up mostly in puzzles on very, very many questions. Once you get this second part of morality or the laws of freedom, namely the right stuff, into view, you can do a lot more, right? So you can talk about private property, contract, status right, private law, public law, but also inner right to freedom, which is where you get Kantian type of discussions, or bodily integrity or freedom of speech, this kind of stuff. And overall, you get a theory of freedom that is still a priori. That's Kant's, favorite thing, that it has to be a priori. It's principles of our mind and, the way our reason works, whatever reason is. So you get a very powerful theory of freedom. And my new book will still talk a lot about that, exactly what it is about Kant's theory, in my view, that makes it possible to seriously engage, say, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, but also, in my view, it's a philosophically better position than those theories. So that's part of what I try to argue in my new book. It's more powerful as an ideal theory or as a theory of freedom. Now, spinning forward a bit, including to the first book, but also to this discussion of barbarism, anarchy, despotism, and republic, one issue that became increasingly puzzling to me, including because I do work on feminist philosophy and I work on philosophy of sex, love, and gender, is the very strange things Kant says about these things, about women, for example, and let alone about sex, but also about people who are not so into straight sex or not only into straight sex. It's a very, very puzzling part of Kant. So let me put it a different way, let alone when you add the racism stuff. So part of the puzzle is, how can somebody who really revolutionized when it comes to freedom and really puts dignity and the right to freedom with the individual, how can the same human being end up being so sexist, so racist, so heterosexist? And it suddenly appears in his text, this sort of very, very bad stuff. So on the one hand, it's a puzzle about human being, what it is about us when we do very bad things. On the other hand, also including that one of the most brilliant minds when it comes to freedom thinker, revolutionized philosophy, he had it too. So on the one hand, I wanted to understand how come in Kant and what explains his, stream of consciousness when he suddenly switches from talking about freedom and right and dignity, whatever, to something horribly racist or horribly sexist or horribly heterosexist. Like in his head, how did it work? That was puzzling to me, because if you read these works, the groundwork, Critique of Practical Reason, Doctrine of Right, if you just use the principles of freedom, so you're going to analyze everything in terms of persons, rights, duties, etc., this kind of stuff like women doesn't seem to appear. All that appears is persons and having rights, or let alone sex. Why would a person as such, somebody who is capable of moral responsibility, what is sex all about? So it was very puzzling to me, both when you read it, so like when you read Kant's account of marriage, suddenly he starts to talk about reciprocal possession of each other's sexual organs in the middle of an analysis of people's right with respect to other people. That you have some sort of legal claim on them, my spouse. So I was very puzzled about this stuff in Kant. And so with time, and things don't actually move very fast in philosophy. It takes years usually, each step. It feels fast, but really it's very slow. So with time, I found the pieces. And so part of the puzzle was that in the introduction in the Metaphysics of Morals, there's a huge clue to how Kant thinks of it, because there he says it's very important, when we try and analyze freedom, that we don't mix in what he calls moral anthropology over here. It's very important that we don't mix it in because it's contingent. And given how our minds work, the problem is if you mix in, sort of anthropology, human life type stuff, I'm going to add more of that later, you're going to end up with and you mix that into your freedom account, you're highly likely to just reproduce your own prejudices. You're highly likely to just think that what is possible for free being or what free society is like, you're highly likely to just sort of reproduce what you have seen and think that that's the universal truth about the matter. So he's very clear about the danger of moral anthropology and the way in which our prejudices sit in how our cultures work, or how it is to be a human being in the way in which somehow we live in cultures. And if we really want a theory of freedom, it's important that in that theory of freedom, then we separate between what's a priori and what is contingent, or what is contingent then in the sense of is constitutive of what it's like to be a human being on planet Earth. So I think I have about 15 minutes left. Is that right?
sorry, 15, 20? Just,
Okay. Yeah, I just want to time myself.
Okay.
So what I did then was I went to figure out what on earth did he mean. He just mentions it in the introduction to the doctrinal right. Where did we go to find the clues about how he thought about it? And somewhat surprising to me anyway, I first, of course, read the anthropology, but the anthropology is not the most systematic account at all. And it certainly is filled to the rim with a lot of Kant's own prejudices. So it wouldn't be the systematic bit I was looking for to actually develop whatever needs to be in this place of moral anthropology if I want a really good theory. Like, so happenstance, and not very likely for me, but where I went was to Kant's religion. And in the religion, which was very surprising to me, but there you find an account of what he calls the predisposition to good in human nature. And was for me the systematic element I wanted in Kant. It's not just the sort of a rambling of all his prejudices, but systematically, how did he think about moral anthropology, or the structure of moral anthropology? And the predisposition to good, then I realized, and I'm going to go a little bit fast here, but not too fast, because I'm going to use it in the 4 political conditions, is that Kant too has a bit of an account of what we know from Aristotle, sort of human nature, and is also three-part type of theory, which means that he thinks we have an animality. And if you remember from Aristotle, you have vegetative soul, sensomotoric soul, rational soul. Kant has something somewhat similar, but not exactly the same. But he has animality, which makes you into a living being, humanity, which makes you into a rational being, and personality, which makes you into a responsible being. He also thinks then, and I'm going to be a little bit fast, but we can go back here, okay? So he thinks that animality is constituted by 3 self-reflexive drives or ways of being in the world. So it's reflexive self-consciousness, not reflective, meaning that it's internal to a self that is consciously striving, but it is not already, say, a reflective self-conscious being. So all animals on this account, put it differently too, in Kant's account, as I read it, there's no vegetative soul present in this account of the predisposition to good in human nature. And the reason for that is that the vegetative soul, we have it, but we can't be conscious with regard to it in the relevant sense. So I cannot be conscious to how the cells in my eyes divide and the eye sustains itself as a biological being. And that's part of why it is not part to predisposition to good in human nature for Kant. So he only focuses on the conscious parts. And so animality is conscious. For human beings, like for other animals, as we start, it's predominantly reflexive self-consciousness with 3 prongs to it. And so we strive, or newborn babies is susceptible to affectionate love, to sensuous touch, and they strive to survive themselves. And on this account, how they do it is through pleasure and displeasure, initially with regard to a natural vitality. So the baby eats, for example, until the baby no longer takes pleasure in it and it seeks to be harmonious or feel peaceful with its own natural vital force. With time, the babies, like other babies, animal babies, they use associative thought of sound or smells to inform whether it's pleasure or displeasure coming. So the sound of the parents will make it feel happy. But with time, and here we go up here, what happens is that, so this is the very start. These are the kinds of behaviors that babies also involve in. Not so long into it, it is the case that babies can smile to their parents, and they smile back, and it's pleasant, and it's a very Rousseauian element in Kant's account here, which means that the baby in smiling is aware of being seen and takes pleasure in it. So it can relate to an image of itself as seen. And this is a little bit contrast to Rousseau, who thought this was amour propre. So it was only negative. For Kant, initially it's good, but it's very corruptible and very strong in us. So all the social emotions ultimately is related to this, like envy, jealousy, etc. But generally it's to be seen, and to be seen by somebody who loves and cares for you feels good. It's good and existentially important for us to be seen. This bit here is the scream of the baby for Kant's account. So human babies are the only ones who scream, and Kant thinks that's brute freedom. So to scream is an expression of frustration that you cannot act. And with time, if we combine freedom with then not just having associative thought, but other kinds of thoughts, and we have many types of thought, but most importantly, so his judgment, associative thought, imagination, aesthetic thought, teleological thought. But this is a speed version now, but as we develop the ability to have abstract conceptual thought, tables, chairs, also that the I come. So when you speak to the baby, you can't only say, does Helga want milk? But do you want milk? And the baby starts being able to say, I want milk, which means reflective self-consciousness is there. And also starting to master concepts, abstract concepts like milk. As that develops, the ability to choice develops. And when you, for Kant, are able to understand that I ought not to do something just because it's the wrong thing to do, that's when you have started to develop the ability to be morally responsible. Okay? So with all of this present, it's very easy. I'm not going to do it now for reasons of time, but it becomes very easy to understand how Kant thinks about human beings and how come he has a certain way of thinking what a good realization of these, of our predisposition to good is. The moral part is mostly up here. It becomes related to this, whereas the rest of it is deeply into his account of happiness, what it means for a human being to become happy, flourishing. Also, here, I'm going to do a tiny bit of it, but not so much of it. Kant, in the religion, you also find corresponding to the predisposition to good in human nature, you get the propensity to evil in human nature. And Kant thinks that our propensity to evil is something that is related to the fact that we can choose. So I can choose things, set ends on my own. And so I can choose things that are not good for me or are good for me. And I can be tempted to act in very many different ways. Importantly too, and still a little bit speed version, but we all grow up in families and cultures that have serious pathologies involved in them. So, and we live with those pathology thinking they are normal much before we are actually able to be morally responsible for actions, both ethically, but also legally. And so we are mixed bags by the time we get to becoming able to be morally responsible. We have things that are really quite destructive that we think are normal. We have things that are just normal in my family. We think everybody does it. And we have things we have in our cultures that we only do in our cultures, but you think everybody should be doing it because it feels so good. And there will be things in our cultures that involves pretty serious dehumanization of others and or ourselves. But in our mind, it's related to a story about what a healthy, flourishing human life is. And Kant himself is a beautiful illustration of that problem. In my view, also another aspect of this account that is quite beautiful philosophically is that you can use it to distinguish between the problem of doing an instance of a wrongdoing, having a pattern of wrongdoing, and having a way of life of wrongdoing. And so I can get angry once, and there are two versions of that. I can be non-self-deceived about that being a problem, two angry ones, or I can be self-deceived. So I got too angry and I can be puzzled and I can say, hey, I was too angry. I don't know what happened there. Or I can say, if I really was too angry, that's the assumption here, if I'm self-deceived, I can say, oh, no, oh, that person deserved it. And so it's worse always when you're self-deceived about the problem, because then first you have to get rid of the self-deception, and then you can actually get to the heart of the problem. Like, why was I? In order for me to be puzzled by my too much anger, I have to already know that it was not okay. It can also be that's frailty then on my account. A pattern is if I get angry too often. And again, I can be not self-deceived about that. Oh, the world is so difficult. Thank goodness I am there, so I can help to set the world right by shouting at it. Or I can be, that's self-deceived. Or I cannot be self-deceived. It's like, I have an anger problem and I can go and get some therapy. So lastly, I can be just furious and full of rage all the time and think that, and then I rationalize that anger. You can do that with God, morality, anything, any sort of grand story according to which my fantastic anger is just a sign of my own virtue or goodness. And so I go about destroying myself and others in the name of the good, or under the guise of the good. Okay, so if we have all of these pieces now in place, we almost have all the pieces you need also to understand that paper that I once wrote on these 4 preconditions. Let me skip a little bit ahead there on that. So having all of that in the background, can you see the titles and things? Okay, good. Mine looks a bit weird. So now I'm skipping ahead again to these 4 conditions, okay? So I used a ton of what you just saw in that book to try and give a new account of sex, love, and gender as a Kantian theory. And it is going to be a very, very big part also of my new book, but then that book is only on legal political philosophy and not sex, love, and gender particularly, also doing more race in it. And another element that is super important in this sort of transition from the first to now the second book is that around the time of the end of writing that first book, I really fell in love with Hannah Arendt. And I don't think that's an accident, because increasingly now I wanted to write that book that in some ways would correspond to what I wrote my dissertation on, which was Kant and Locke on political obligations. But, it's been a love all along. And so now I do many, as was mentioned in the introduction, Hobbes and Rousseau, but also many other thinkers that are really important. And one reason for wanting to go to Hannah Arendt, I think, is that even though the stuff I just mentioned is good, and I'm going to add one more element and then wrap it up very quickly, Kant and also the doctrinal right type literature you find out there is not very good at political evil. Like if you're trying to pondering, say, the world today, and how are we even going to understand many of the very important things going on? It seems that just reading, say, my early work on Kant's ideal theory of doctrinal right or Arthur Ibsen's Force and Freedom, it's not going to give you all the tools you need, in my view. And so I think, or one thing I want to do is develop this theory, the doctrinal right piece, into a more complete theory of justice that not only has the doctrinal right, a priori stuff, going for it, but also now has human nature in it, or the human condition in it, and has judgment in it, which Hannah Arendt is very good on. So judging, not just having a theory of the human condition, if you speak in Arendtian language, or moral anthropology, if you speak with Kant, but also an account of historical societies, or what then Arendt calls a theory of judgment. And finally, in my view, we need a theory of political evil. What is it when we're getting, when evil happens, and then combining these 2 last elements, evil and historical societies? That is, we need a bigger theory of how to evaluate the societies we live in, actual historical societies. Put it differently again, if all we have when we look at historical societies is an account of civil society, as it traditionally has been understood in legal and political philosophy, right? Civil society. And then the contrast is the state of nature, right? So before you get legal political institutions, civil society, the state of nature, if that's all you have, then either we're going to be in the state of nature or we're going to be in civil society, in actual historical societies. Yes, and I think that's not true. So I want a theory that is able to speak to how in actual societies, we often have a mix of things that belong in the state of nature or in civil society, or more generally, that are much more complex than just the distinction between state of nature and civil society is going to get you. And give me 3 minutes and I'll try and spin through that. And then Özlem, you take over. So what I did then, I started again with Kant's account of the 4 legal political conditions. He argues that you can think of the main principles involved when we create legal political conditions as being combinations between 3 types of principles. He writes this in the Anthropology. It's one of those gems you find there. So it's the principles of freedom, law, and violence, Freiheit, Gesetz, and Gewalt. And he says you can combine these such that you in 4 different ways. The best way, which is the republic. And the republic then is an idea of reason now, right? Idea of reason, I'm combining some principles and it issues an idea. It's an idea I can do because I have reason. If I combine freedom, law, and violence, I get a republic, which enables rightful external freedom. Pretty much what you find in, say, Arthur Ripstein's famous book, Force and Freedom. It's an attempt at saying what a republic looks like. Freedom, law, and violence. The other conditions is despotism, which is law and violence, but no freedom. Arthur Ripstein thinks that this is like the bad version of this. That's part of what I'm challenging here, okay? But he thinks this is like the really good thing and this is the semi-good thing. And if we have this, you should reform it into that. And despotism then is just law and violence, but no freedom. Finally, for Arthur Ripstein, for example, or early Helga Varden, these 2 concepts are related to the state of nature. Anarchy is just freedom and provisional law for Kant, but no violence. And barbarism is just violence, no law and no freedom. And so like Ripstein or early Helga this is the best thing in the state of nature, which is devoid of justice or injustice. It's just everybody happens to agree, and they happen to agree that they should treat each other in very free ways. And so it's the best version is sort of happy living together, but no coercion, no violence, no nothing, coincidentally. And this is like the bad version of it, when this is gone now and all you have is this, and that's like the perversion of anarchy. So in the 4 condition thing, I challenge this and I say, no, this is the good thing we should strive to go to. But in reality, we can have that type of legal political framework, like our constitution can be committed to these things, like where I live in the US is committed to this type of system. But within it, we have, I called pockets in that, both in my book, in this article that about the 4 ones, but in my new book, I'm exploring both pocket and strains of these things in the actual historical society. One illustration, and then we'll take it from there, wherever Özlem wants to take it. So you can imagine, for example, that we live in a society where there's a general law protecting people's right to bodily integrity. Yes, that would be a Republican, on Kant's account, good law. So I have a right to bodily integrity. However, at the same time, there could be a pocket of laws that requires women to dress in a certain way, or not speak out in public, or not be professors, or something. That would be usually a despotic pocket in that society, because the only way to justify such a pocket or justify it would be by appeal to maybe women's natures, or a particular interpretation of a religion, or something like that, not freedom tracking persons. So there could be a pocket or a strain of injustice within an otherwise Republican constitution. Similarly, there could be a law in that in an actual historical society where women cannot marry women. So if you live with a woman, you cannot get the access to marriage law, for example. Finally, in such a society, there could be a law that says that if you love a woman and you kiss her lovingly, you have committed a crime. So that on this account would be a pocket of barbarism. So one way to sum up that stuff then is to say that part of what I'm developing is that once we move from a republic, sort of an ideal theory of just saying what the idea of a republic is, down to an actual historical society, part of what our judgment will involve is trying to describe it accurately, various aspects of it, to say, is this a despotic pocket or strain of this legal political institutional framework? Is it an anarchic one? Are people just excluded? Or is it one where the people are people who exercising their rights to freedom in various ways and love and who they are, where that's going to trigger violence against them? Even more radically, very lately, and I'll stop there, is to say that maybe actually, this is an idea suggested to me by my colleague in Mexico, UNAM, called Efrain Lazos. He says maybe in actual society, the best starting point would be to say, we can have fundamentally maybe, say, a despotic society and have a pocket of republic and a pocket of anarchy. And, and if we just let any one of them be the fundamental one, we're going to get a much more accurate and let the others be pockets and strains. And that seems very convincing to me, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You gave us much food for thought. Really, it was really interesting. Thank you so much. Özlem Hocam, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to listen this inspiring speech. And I would like to make an evaluation, but I just would like to give a brief summary of feminist critics to point out the Helga Varden's position in Kantian works, between the Kantian scholars, if it's available, if it's okay for you. Because Helga's works is very special. I think it's very special and groundbreaking aspect among Kantian scholars' studies. For this reason, first of all, I would like to give a very brief summary of the feminist critics against the Kantian system. In recent years, feminist scholars put forward criticism in philosophy, similar to what Kant achieved a new method in philosophical thinking. These criticisms, which claim that Western metaphysics established a hegemonic relationship between reason and nature from ancient time or from Plato to Kant, are based on a continuity thesis. Feminist criticism of Western metaphysics, particularly of Kant's philosophy, can be classified into maybe 6 main categories. The first one is about gendered epistemology. Feminist scholars argue that the Kant epistemology, particularly his emphasis on reason and universal principles, neglects the embodied and situated nature of knowledge. And they highlight how gender bias and social context shape knowledge production and seek a more inclusive and diverse epistemology. And the second one is about moral philosophy and ethics. Feminist critic Kant's moral philosophy for its emphasis on abstract, decontextualized moral principles and its exclusion of feminine virtues and perspectives. Feminist thinkers point out an ethics that recognize the importance of care, empathy, and relationality in moral decision making also. The third one is about gendered subjectivity. Helga has already pointed out, I think. Kant's concept of autonomous rational subject is seen as gendered and exclusionary by most of feminist thinkers. Feminists challenge the idea that rationality and autonomy have inherently masculine qualities and demand a more inclusive understanding of subjectivity that accounts for diverse experiences and perspectives. And fourth one is more general account, the mainstream philosophy of history. Feminist scholars argue that Kant's philosophy of history perpetuates a male-centered narrative that marginalized women's contributions and experiences. And they advocate for a revisionist approach that includes the voices and experiences of women in the construction of historical narratives. And the fifth one is about aesthetics and beauty. It's very special. Kant's conception of beauty and aesthetics has been criticized for its gendered assumptions and exclusionary criteria. And feminists challenge the narrow definition of beauty and try to show that how it reinforces oppressive beauty standards and patriarchal norms. They advocate for a more inclusive and diverse understanding of aesthetics. And this last one is about exclusionary assumptions in anthropology. This critique puts forward the idea that discriminatory expressions in his anthropology lectures are not only based on historical context, but when examined in the conjunction with his anthropology, also endorse racism, colonialism, and sexism, which are inherent in his philosophical framework. According to the critics, women are defined as passive beings by nature and determined more by inclination than reason, and therefore cannot be legitimate citizens, equal partners in marriage, for example, or even capable scholars. Because of these definitions, there is an accusation that his critical philosophy has deeply androcentric assumptions. This classification is a general summary of feminist criticism of Kant philosophy and doesn't encompass the entire range of debates and perspectives within feminist philosophy. Nevertheless, it can be useful to demonstrate how feminist thinkers have criticized various aspects of Kant's philosophy. Helga Varden's works especially consider the critics of moral autonomy and try to make a connection between the positive sympathetic readings. It's commonly accepted that moral agency in Kant's practical philosophy is based on rational action rather than emotional responses, leading to the perception that it embodies trait more commonly associated with male identity than female identity. Most feminists think that Kant maintains the division of the Western metaphysical traditions such as nature, reason, emotional, rational decisions, women, men, more generally, and other categories that are fundamentally based on Western dualism. The political results of this formulation causes not to assume women in the same place as men. Simone de Beauvoir pointed out that through the centuries, women have ideally leave their immanent realm to join the transcendental realm of men. Her analysis wasn't only relevant to the cultural social status of women, but also reflecting the philosophical formulation of the discrimination. And Varden tries to show that Kant's ethical and political theory based on normative and abstract concepts, but still offers possibilities for women or any marginalized group by focusing on the issues on which he has been most criticized, universal norms, the doctrine of rights, and even anthropology. Here we can say that Varden's work is very inclusive, but also controversial. However, we can also say that it's a powerful weapon for transforming rather than abandoning the possibilities of philosophy because of mainstream philosophy's reliance on a gendered conception of reason. Varden's intervention in universalism makes a crucial contribution to bringing identities, subjectivities, and problems that have been relegated to the emergence of the philosophy for centuries back onto the philosophical agenda. Turning to the possibilities of Kant philosophy, which even Kant probably recognized, is also important. This is necessary in order to reconstruct the theoretical foundations for the defense of the right of all. However, I believe that there are still some points that need to be discussed. For example, it is necessary to discuss whether Kant's account of women as counterparts to the marriage contract in his doctrine of rights is really sufficient to define them as a real subject of rights. On the other hand, the fact that in both Kant's and Arendt's thought, the boundaries between the private and public spheres or realms are drawn quite clearly and sharply shows how the rights envisaged in theory can be realized in practice. Additionally, Varden invites us to reconsider Kant's concepts such as anarchy, barbarism, and despotism in their contemporary relevance, particularly concerning the protection of the rights and autonomy of individuals who are associated with anarchic political forces or barbaric forces and are compelled to remain in a state of nature, such as women or LGBTQ+, or who are controlled not by legitimate laws, by coercive illegitimate laws due to their sexual orientations or political identities. She calls for a reinterpretation of these concepts along with their contemporary meanings to protect the rights and autonomy of individuals who are coerced under the compelling force of illegitimate laws rather than legitimate laws based on their sexual or other identities or political identities, for example. Yes, at this point, I believe that Varden's work undertakes a very challenging task of rectifying Kant's seemingly most problematic sexist approach within his ethical, political, and legal perspectives. I understand this endeavor as an attempt to reframe philosophers' method in ways they never anticipated through new paths and readings. I firmly believe there's a legitimate aspects to such endeavors, especially for those who have been historically marginalized with the field of philosophy. This is also upholds the principle of mutual benefits, I think. It addresses inclusion for those marginalized from philosophy while simultaneously expanding the philosopher's views for the sake of contemporary problems. Perhaps this is somewhat one-sided evaluation because I share similar perspective to Helga's. Nevertheless, I believe that the fundamental question raised by feminists who direct radical criticism and Kant should serve as a kind of gadflight behind our perspective. Why do we feel compelled to limit ourselves to the concepts and categories mainstream philosophy for a more inclusive philosophical perspective? It's a big question. I know it's a very general question. And I think that Helga has already responded it by her pocket theory. But I just would like to have more information about it. Maybe I can add a question about the terminology. She translates the German term Gewalt as violence. I think Mary Gregor has used it for force or coercion. I'm not sure, but maybe Helga would like to say about this because I think it's very important for his theory, her theory, sorry. Yes, maybe I have more questions, but I would like to give space to people who would like to ask question, and we can jump to question as answer session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Helga, would you like to say a few words before we go to Q&A, or?
Yeah, I could just talk about the last bit. First of all, thank you
Yeah.
so much,
You're welcome.
Özlem, because yeah, your summary is just beautiful, including a lot of things that I'm trying to respond to is exactly the historical feminist criticisms of Kant, that as a general rule, I just agree with them. So the challenge is on, and I'm just trying to find ways to hold on to what I think makes this a very attractive type of philosophical system, hold Kant accountable for his serious failures and trying to understand them. So one reason too, I mean, why abandon Kant? I think understanding Kant's tendency to evil is to understand ourselves. And so I don't think, I think it's its own sort of source of self-deception to think that, oh yeah, only Kant is racist or sexist or heterosexist. So I think by studying him, we also study ourselves. And that's important, I think. On the Gewalt thing, yeah, it's giantly important. And if you, like you said, a lot of what I do is very controversial, but so is my retranslation of Gewalt. So as you know, Arthur's book is Force and Freedom, and I believe it's inspired by Mary Gregor's translation of Gewalt as force.
I think, yeah.
Yeah. So in the Mary Gregor's translation of anthropology, where you find these principles, she translates Gewalt as force. I think that's not correct. So, but it is possible, and some of you know more German than me, though I'm totally fine on German. I'm originally Norwegian, so our languages are very close. But
sorry, it changed the meaning of the, for example, anarchy. It seems to be more sympathetic when you translate it and when you use it with violence or translate as violence. So yeah,
I don't think. Yeah, so one is just that I think Kant really meant it, and so in this article where you can see that has these four conditions in the title. I do some of that interpretive work of looking at Kant, and Kant does actually one place translate Gewalt with violentia in Latin. And I think it's very difficult to say, and he really meant force. No, I think he really meant violence, you know, and I think there are pretty deep philosophical reasons he did so. And I'll come back to them, but I promise not to talk more than 2 minutes on this. But one reason in German you could say Gewalt, because Staatsgewalten, for example, could be like state powers or state forces and not state violences. So it's Staatsgewalten is just like sort of the public institutions. So it's a way in which you can talk about the state's institutions and you use Gewalt, and that lends some force to the, lends some plausibility to the force translation. Here's a long way of saying why I think he really meant violence. I think he really means violence. Both it textually really matches, but second, philosophically, I think the most general concept is going to either be force, Kraft, or power, maybe. And apparently Angela Davis, you know, she never got to complete her doctoral dissertation, but I just learned last week that because she was imprisoned by, you know, the US state, and she was a Black woman, academic woman, so they were highly targeted, and she ended up in prison. She never finished her dissertation. But apparently the title she had for her perspective for her PhD in philosophy was going to be Kant's, something like a Kantian theory of force, something like that. And again, I don't think that's an accident. So here's one way to think of it, also with Arendt. If you know Arendt, that this translation of Gewalt to violence is consistent with how she describes violence. And the point of violence is that it destroys. And last 30 seconds. So one way to say it is, she thinks it's inherently very human uses of forcefulness, is that when we say create a world, we destroy to create. Or when we preserve ourselves, we eat something to sustain ourselves. So put it differently, we cannot create substances, or we cannot create something that becomes its own self-sustaining thing through time. That's beyond what we can do. And she thinks hence Prometheus had to steal fire from the gods, right, in that story, because we can't be that creative. So even when we create a world and a home on planet Earth, we destroy something and then transform them into art or into objects by means of which we create a world. And so then if you think of violence now, I think the violence, once you turn to moral philosophy, is violence aimed at other human beings. And insofar as we don't use violence because everybody behaves well, it just becomes a coercive framework, coercion, Zwang in German, so coercive framework. But ultimately, the threat is violence. The state monopoly on coercion is backed up with violence, ultimately all the way to lethal violence. And so I don't think there's an accident that Kant wrote Gewalt, and not Kraft or Zwang or something else he could have chosen. Okay, now Q&A.
Thank you, Helga. Shall we move on, Özlem, or did you want to say something?
No, we can go to, yeah.
Okay. So we will move on with the Q&A part. So please, if you have comments, questions, raise your hands. Saniyeciğim, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Helga, for a wonderful talk. And now I'm inspired to read your paper on this. Thank you, Özlem, for the very nice commentary. I actually had the same question that you asked about the translation of Gewalt, but now it's much clearer, and thank you. My other question was about this tripartite aspects of human nature. I myself make use of Kant's account of human nature in some of my articles as well, but I slightly have a different account of the Kantian human nature. I usually start with animality, just like you do, and then move to rationality as opposed to humanity, and then say humanity is kind of the combination of animality plus rationality. So my question is, why do you identify humanity with rationality in your hierarchical human nature account? And where do you get the personality? Does Kant talk about that in the religion? Because I haven't read it from cover to cover, just bits and pieces here and there. So that's why I was curious about your account of Kant's account of human nature.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's excellent. Yeah, it is. I'm just using Kant's words. And so it is puzzling that he puts humanity there. Another controversy, if I just show you the thing again, is, so we're over here, right? And so I stay with his concepts, and there is a puzzle that I don't have an entirely satisfying answer to you, which is exactly why he says humanity here. I can say to you what I think it is, but, and personality up here. So this is a person. So to be a person means that you have moral feeling, which means that for Kant, that you can feel the ought, that I ought to do something. And so I'm responsive to my own reasoning powers in that way. And for Kant, that's what enables us to be morally responsible. And importantly, I think in Kant's imagination of this, both his interpretation of religious text, but also his literally his imagination of the universe. I don't think he thinks, starting with the latter, the universe, I don't think Kant thinks that only human beings could be persons. So I don't think he thinks that human animals, the kinds we are, the only kinds of beings in the entire universe who could be persons, responsible. And that's also how I think of him as interpreting religious stories on this, like angels. So angels have moral feeling, but they have an is. They just do the right thing and not an ought. Human beings have an ought because we have complex beings because of the way in which we are embodied as social beings. And so we don't experience that to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do as an is, but as an ought. But you can imagine, like we do in sci-fi or fantasy books, different types of embodiments who could experience doing the right thing, that is doing what their reason authorizes them to do, in a different way. And I think Kant wants that to be the case. I think he deeply thinks that's true. And so another way too is that if you just use these two bits here, this rational end setting becomes, in my view, to act on maxims. And because we have reason, we can consider our maxims, consider whether or not they could be laws for rational beings. So we can universalize them. And so, and then so that becomes this becomes maxims. And then because I'm capable of moral responsibility, I can learn to do something because it's the right thing to do. And that opens up morality. So for me, the reason why he does what he does here is very much like this. This is the freedom bit of it. Oh, bummer. And here comes, sometimes though, he includes the social, both in his discussions of angels. So the fallen angel, I think this is his interpretation of that story, why we find it plausible. So angels would be then messengers from God. And so they would, in these stories, the people who meet an angel, they are struck, right, by awe. And you could imagine, he thinks, and so they have to appear, right? They have to be sensed in these stories as messengers from God. And they fill humans with awe in these stories. And I think Kant thinks that that's why the fallen angel is what the fallen angel is in that story, because when you imagine a being that has the social sense of self and has an is, but has the social sense of self, you could imagine that that could be tempting for you to want that ought for yourself. And so the story is the angel who wants to be God. But the point is that the angel cannot create being because there's only one being. You know, there can only be one being. There's being and non-being. And angels cannot create it. And so it becomes a fallen angel, and the fallen angel only destroys. But it comes from the temptation of also having a social sense of self. So I think this is roughly, I think, what Kant thinks. And you can also see in his account of right that the right to freedom is matched by the duty of rightful honor. So a lot of his right stuff actually does appeal to the social sense of self, but not to the animality part. And so hence I have this one because I think it does a lot of work for Kant. And I think he wants person to be distinct from and not only for human beings. But having said all of that, I mean, there's still these challenges with human dignity or, you know, how exactly to read all the passages where he uses humanity. As usual, I think we can always get something to be consistent with how we do it, but that doesn't, to me, that doesn't get us anywhere. It's just, all the interpretations can do that. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I mean, the reason I would, just a quick maybe follow-up, the reason I would want to say that humans are persons is because in the lectures on education, Kant says that we are not born humans, but we become humans through education, in the sense that, you know, through education, we kind of acquire certain maybe these rational feelings, moral feelings as well. And so it's kind of at the end of the training, and that's why, you know, like being a person is also, it seems like at the end of our education. That's why I wanted to use them, but I have to look at the religion passage again. Thank you.
Oh, I completely agree, and I think that's still important also in this view. It's maybe a different way of doing it, but I certainly don't want to lose that stuff. And one way to say it here is that sometimes I use a meal to illustrate. So when you start eating as a baby, you just eat to survive. It's exercising this, and it becomes combined with associative thought, but also socialized in a certain sense with these things. So you're loved as you eat as a newborn baby, you're being touched and you're eating, and it's a harmonious thing. But with time, a long story short, is that we transform these animalistic drives and this way of associative thought together with all these kinds of thought. And so we move from eating to having meals. And being able to have a meal means that we develop all of this into an integrated whole. And only if we're able to do that in some ways, then do we fully realize our humanity, right? So you learn what is polite to do, what's not polite to do, how to present the food aesthetically beautifully, right? Which, incarnation of that is Turkey, right? So part of why it's so amazing to come to Istanbul is because of the beauty involved in the food, right? And so it's this way in which we develop this, but also how we then have lots of social rules around eating and ways of being respectful. So eating for us becomes a very complex activity, and it's certainly not the same as what we do when we start as newborn babies, or the same as, say, how my dog eats, even though the dog is very lovely. So I don't want to lose any of that, even if I do it slightly differently. The other little bit I don't want to keep, even if Kant has formulations like that, I don't want those, say, who have disabilities, cognitive disabilities, which makes it impossible, say, to do all the social stuff perfectly, to have less humanity. Or I don't want an account according to newborn babies have less humanity, So there's certain kinds of work philosophically I want this stuff to do as a capacity, not as a fully realized thing, which is just accidental.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Özlem, your hand is,
Yeah.
yeah.
And thank you. I just would like to give an example. Helga, you already have referred that Helga wants milk. I think Kant uses the same example in anthropology with the name of Carl, of course, the masculine name. Carl wants to eat. When a child wants to something, for example, at the first stance, as a first step, he can't think on himself. He was just feeling himself, but he wasn't thinking on himself. But because of this, he called himself as Carl, not I. It's very late in the childhood period to use the term of adverb of I to express himself, for example. And Kant's, I think Kant would like to point out, if we would like to think on ourselves, we need other persons, and it will be a first formulation of his theory of intersubjectivity. And I'm not sure that its relevance, there's a relevance to your definition or the terms you have pointed differences between two concepts. One of them was reflexive and reflective, and maybe it corresponds to a reflective stage. I am not sure, but I just would like to ask you. And I think that it's relevant to Saniye's questions, and it comes from our animality, feelings ourselves. We have feelings about ourselves, yes, but maybe animals have the same feelings. I don't know, same or maybe similar feelings, but only a human can think on himself or herself. Yeah, maybe you would like to say something about it. I just, would like to make a contribution. Thank you.
Yeah, it's excellent. So, so many ways of saying it, and maybe also try and make it a little bit relevant to law then. So one way to think of it is we certainly have lots of feelings like other animals do. So when we are being affectionate with our cats or dogs or, you know, our pets, is not like they are just seemingly affectionate. They are affectionate, and we engage each other really well. So it's not that we, if I share that one more time, so it's not like we don't share that, but the suggestion on the Kantian account is that, so what opens up animality for us and also for the other animals is that we have reflexive, with an X, reflexive self-consciousness. And reflexive self-consciousness is just that we are self, we are consciously striving self, right? So that you can't describe animals as not consciously striving to, say, feed themselves or look after their babies, or being how they touch each other, or how they touch also human animals. Sure, absolutely. And on the Kant, if you want to do some Kantianese, if you get high from the systematic stuff like I do, then these three ways in which we are striving for Kant are enabled by the relational categories of the understanding. So it's three types of mind structures that sort of informs how we are striving as a self and other animals. And so it's substance, which is self-preservation, causality is the sex drive, and community is affectionate community. So it's the way in which our animalistic minds are already sort of engaging the world in specific ways. And I think on this account, and I think for Kant too, who was fascinated by elephants, part of what fascinates with elephants is that they are so very social. Today, we have a lot of tests on other animals, like the mirror test, right? Some animal, including elephants, dolphins, chimps, you can introduce a mirror into the environment. You can put a little dot on them without them noticing. And then they can use the mirror, because which you can see in that they then try and get rid of the dot. So they have that social sense of self that for human beings is very prominent in smiling. And most animals don't pass the mirror test, but some think that, for example, dogs have a social sense of self, but their behavior, what we should look to, Dan Kelly, for example, at Purdue has this argument, is how they pee in the world. Because the dogs, they seem to have a very clear sense of the social area of dogs by how they pee in the same places and how they sniff themselves, sniff the pee. So they seem to orient with the whole social world of the dogs in the neighborhood in that way. It's not the image, the smile thing, they seem to have a different technique. And we could imagine that yet other animals have behaviors we don't understand that has to do with this social sense of self. But importantly, if you don't have a social sense of self, then you don't have the various kinds of social behaviors, right? That's part of what's important about it. Lastly, not to talk you all to death, but the reflective part for Kant, the self-reflective part, just like you say, has to do with the fact that at some point in child development, the child not only feels themselves reflexively. So if you say, does Helga want milk? Helga says, yeah, right? But at some point you can say, do you want milk? And then Helga will no longer say, Helga wants milk, but I want milk. And so that's Kant's account of the I, the reflective, self-conscious I, that I can reflect and be aware of myself as an I who wants things. And so on this account, it becomes an account of how come, say, in child development, there's this very peculiar stage when the child learns to say no, and then nothing happens. And how empowering the child feels when it says no, right? Because that's the start of an exercise of choice. And then the last little bit on this one is the feelings. I think one way to say is this with Anarchy. Maybe many of you have heard about Du Bois, and now I'm going to introduce another one. So as usual, you might have heard of Frederick Douglass and Du Bois, but they were fantastic women at the same time. And of course, they have not yet gotten the same attention as Du Bois and Frederick Douglass, but they were just as amazing. One was the Sojourner Truth. Another one, contemporary with Du Bois, was Anarchy. And one of her arguments in her fantastic book, which you should all read, A Voice from the South, is that it's very Kantian, or this is a way to say her argument with Kant. Because we have all these kinds of thought. So part of what is important about education, or whether it is also formal education of the kind you can do in schools, where people teach you how to read and write, and you can access the entire world of written word, which is revolutionary, of course. Or it is in society, is that we learn to feel more and with a lot of nuance. So I am not only angry, but as I develop my ability to feel, I can feel resentment or frustration or rage, and lots and lots and lots of concepts, which makes it the case that I can feel in very nuanced and complex ways. And that's what having these very complex cognitive minds in part enables. So even if we feel like other animals, the way we develop a capacity to feel is also more complex because we have these other kinds of thought. That was a very long answer. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? Selda, Salman, buyurun.
Thank you. Thank you for the beautiful speech. And I would like to also thank to Association of Philosophy in Turkey for organizing this event. My question is that indeed political conditions can be counted as 5. We should add cosmopolitanism, I think. And how do you align your ideas with cosmopolitanism? In which case we have to consider external interference with other countries and other unions or continents, cultures, everything. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, this is excellent. That's just an excellent question. I'll keep them all with me, but also this one. So generally, I mean, you never entirely know how your talk is going to be. It's just you go with it and see if you can say as much as possible. For Kant, the highest good is to pursue happiness within constraints of morality. And the highest political good is perpetual peace. And Kant does not think that perpetual peace is obtainable only by your state being just. So he thinks that not until there's both international justice and cosmopolitan justice can you have actual perpetual peace. And I think for him, perpetual peace is just a condition you, in theory, can imagine can keep going perpetually, right? So he doesn't think that that you can really say that let's say that you have a very good just society. I don't think we've seen that yet, but a very good one. Even at one place on the planet. That type of justice that is achieved there would not be fully just, because in order to be fully just, it has to have just relations with other states and also with cosmopolitan right. And for Kant, cosmopolitan right, I think, tracks individuals on the entire planet and also international waters and airspaces and stuff like that. So I believe that too. So I want the theory to be compatible with that. But one reason also I'm drawn to your question is that I think both in Kant, but in the world, these forces, or the ways in which these political forces work, they are not limited any longer, in part because of technology, to a state, right? And so I don't know if it makes it even worse than other times. I mean, Roman Empire, you know, as it was expanding, it was not a nice thing. But I do, another way of trying to sort of saying it gently, both that some of these all destructive powers, right, whether they're state organized or privately organized on a Kantian type analysis, they are global or regional or something in orientation. And I think Kantian theory, as all theories, are not good enough until we sort of have that complexity brought in. But the other part, which I want to just at least mention, not that I have solutions, I also really am on Hannah Arendt's team on this one, saying that a problem with us having firmer and firmer boundaries is that in some fundamental sense, for now, the rights we have do not track me as a person. They track whether or not I happen to have a state to back me up. So that's one complexity. The other one is she thinks that the danger of totalitarian forces opening up, there are at least two sources, I think, on her thought on that. One is that we don't battle modernity's problem of alienation. So this way in which animality and our social part, especially animality, has sort of lost significance for us. So if you were to use the same mice, if we use my scheme here, so if you know Arendt, she has labor, work, and action, kind of, and then she has like life of the mind, activa vita contemplativa, like it's the life of the mind, and then the human condition becomes like her account of this stuff. And one way to read her account of modernity, or the general criticism of philosophy, is that we have ranked these things in a hierarchy and we really only focus on these things, right? The reflective parts of our minds. So we had 200 years of doing this with Kant, which he thinks is a typical thing in modernity. We never read the rest of Kant. And because that was kind of just, and if you read the groundwork, that's like autonomy. And then the rest is just like heteronomy, like mush, right? And so she thinks that a problem we have in modernity is that we don't have proper understanding of this, the differences. And so we don't have proper understanding of how human beings value different things in different ways, and how is the complete picture that is necessary for a good human life. And so she thinks that the problem of so-called Western philosophy, but also a draw philosophy, that we're so in our minds that we devalue everything that isn't in our minds because we get so high by thinking. And if I were to add anything to that part, it would be that I think so-called Western philosophy always devalued animalistic parts of ourselves. But I think in modernity, or now, we're going to war on it. And we have a new version of a completely overblown social sense of self, which is social media. And so we have our own version of alienation there. But if you go back to your point again, that one reason to read all of this in this very much more embodied way is to bring the importance of these things back again, whether it's political philosophy, legal philosophy, whatever, is that we have to create conditions under which human beings can live meaningful human lives. And so back to her again, she thinks that not only is it a problem for our theories that we don't have a clear understanding of what actually is a human life or the temptation to evil, so we're naive when we make laws or policies or whatever, but she also thinks, and I think she's right, that when we have legal political conditions under which people cannot create meaningful lives. The danger of totalitarian forces show up. Because totalitarian forces, she thinks, deeply appeal to people who cannot figure out how to create meaningful lives. And so the temptation of creating a crazy story that only uses a social sense of self and some rational story to legitimize this crazy project we're taking part in becomes emotionally tempting. And so it's a super long answer to your question. I'm not entirely sure I fully answer it either. It's just a long way of saying I completely agree. The cosmopolitan, but also cosmopolitan tying to each person everywhere, if that makes sense. And that some of these social forces that we're subjected to are exactly on the entire planet, something like, say, Facebook or whatever it is. Which doesn't mean we should get rid of Facebook. It doesn't mean that, but it does open up a special new challenge that we so far have not been able to handle.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can add a social media theorist called Marshall McLuhan. He's famous in his theory that he calls global village. Maybe it helps. I mean, internet helps that we understand we are all human beings. How apart we are from each other is not a real problem in that sense. Maybe it works the opposite way, but we will see. Thank you very much.
No. If I were to add anything, that also that we have a challenge of figuring out how to have better economic systems that actually work, because the current one isn't working well. And again, just like with social media, doesn't mean we're going to burn it all down. That's not going to solve anything, given the kinds of beings we are, but it's not working. And so there's much too much poverty and there's much too much helplessness and much too much power with a few players who are not even within the constraints of any public legal political framework. And we need better theories. And I don't think it's magically going to fix itself. If you want to have a sort of a Marxist optimistic read, oh yeah, it's magically going to happen that we transform it and then we get rid of it. I don't think so. But I also don't think we have a good theory.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Well, thank you so very much, Helga, Özlem, and all the participants. Thank you so much. Gülriz, would you like to close the session?
You can close. You are also on the board of Turkish Association.
Yes,
Yes,
I know. Okay. So, Helga, thank you really very, very much. This was a great discussion. And Özlem, to you too, thank you. And thank you for all the participants. It was lovely to see you. So have a nice day, Helga, since it's a day, and let us have a nice night. Saniye, you are in between. So, okay. See you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much for
Thank
having me, and come and visit me in Chicago.
Yeah, and
Okay,
come visit us in
Istanbul.
Istanbul, in Turkey. Bye-bye.
I'd love
And
to.
Athens, come to Athens, Helga.
All right. Okay.
So take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.